Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Love That Loves You Back, a podcast between myself, Valerie Kabov, and my dear friend Jonathan Fremantle. I'm an artistic miscreant, otherwise known as a self-described third-generation art professional, who's currently raising a fourth-generation art professional, born in the depths of the Pale of Settlement in the former Soviet Union, and partly raised in Australia, lived and worked in London and Paris, and 15 years ago, by a quirk of fate, relocated to Zimbabwe, where I'm the co-founder of First Floor Gallery Harare, trying to figure out life, education, art, and predominantly love of art as life goes on. And without further ado, over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, Jonathan Fremantle. I grew up in Cape Town and studied in London. I did a long apprenticeship in fine art in the old sense, and have been more making art in one way or another ever since then. I live in Edinburgh now, but I also lived for a while in Johannesburg, where I had Hazard Gallery, and that was the context that I met Valerie about 10, 12 years ago, and just loved the conversation we had immediately about painting and how painting is everything. And that conversation's been a constant source of joy and sustenance over the years. So it does make sense that we share the conversation, and look forward to where this goes.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it usually goes anywhere and everywhere, but somehow we always come back to art, and
Yeah,
because it is the love that loves us back. Thank you very
right.
much for joining us, and we look forward to sharing the journey. Hi, Jonathan. And today,
Hi.
today I'm finally in a summer mode, and you're still in a not quite winter mode in Edinburgh.
Not fully. I was in the mountains all week with my brother, and I promised that he would get really fucked up by the weather, but we ended up climbing one mountain in a t-shirt. So
Hello, global warming. Hello, El Nino or something. I mean, Europe was super, super
Mm.
warm as well, and I don't mind.
Mm.
This is, so politically incorrect. So today's like we're going to talk about something else, but
Mm.
something came up, shall we say? Or 2 days ago, the art world sort of lost Frank Auerbach at the age of 93, and so which is
Yeah.
proof that painters really do live a long life, and we wish all the painters super well on this occasion. But I
Mm.
also thought it would be a really interesting conversation because he was the final member of a quartet of Francis Bacon, Lucian, Freud, and Leon Kossoff and Frank Auerbach, that of core group of phenomenally important British painters who were kind of in a which defined a generation, a movement. But and I thought that it was just really interesting to have a conversation about those four and why they're
Yeah.
in that quartet, apart from being of a more or less the same generation that survived the war and the Blitzkrieg and responded to the horrors of World War II, in that context, in a British context. But I also thought, for me, I guess like one of the catalyzing reflections that I saw is that people saw them as a group that pushed back against abstract impression or expressionism and abstraction as a movement. And I just think that that's really, when you look at their work, that's in a way a misnomer. Like, I mean, my point of view, I don't think they pushed back on anything. They were painters. They pushed
Yeah.
to painting as a priority in painting rather than, because you can't honestly look at Bacon and say, oh yes, that he really pushed back against abstraction,
No.
or that he was really pro figuration. That just seems ridiculous. I mean, perhaps Freud more so, but again, if you really had to common line, is that they were all obsessive painters that really worship the medium and really went to that church in a sense, right? I mean,
100%.
but I wanted you to tell the story the pub story.
It's such a foundational story for me because it speaks about um, what you learn in between the lines, when you're in the presence of a master. I used to work in a pub called the Westbourne in Notting Hill in West London. And it's owned by this artist, Sebastian Boyle, who was the son of Mark Boyle, the famous art family, the Boyle family, they call themselves. And his philosophy really with the pub was to employ a kind of unemployable people like artists and musicians, um, and give them free food and booze, and he made a lot of money. And I think because we were kind of not very good at working, but we were very good at creating an atmosphere, the pub had a really great vibe, and people would come to it, including famous people, because the philosophy was also that the customer comes last. So, so perhaps they felt more comfortable that they were just treated badly in the same way as everyone else was. Um, anyway, when I started working there, I was told that one of the customers was Lucian Freud, and he would come on a Sunday with Frank Auerbach. And that made me very excited and also kind of petrified by the prospect, because both painters are great inspiration to my work, and also unforgivingly committed to their practice. You didn't feel like they were going to be like nice, Anyway, sure enough, one day it did happen. It was a Sunday, and I was behind the bar, and they walked in, and it was like the the air changed. These two quite diminutive, quite eagle-like in their appearance, with their beady eyes, walked into the pub and started walking towards me. And in my head, I had a whole spiel prepared for this moment, which involved me telling them that I was an artist and that I would like to buy them a free drink. And I couldn't actually speak. I just stopped being able to speak and just stared at them. And my friend fortunately stepped in and gave them the free drink that I was meant to give them. And at the time, we never had a TV in the pub, but it just happened that it was the World Cup in Germany, and we had a TV there because England were playing a football match. And so everyone was positioned to face the TV in the pub, basically. And I was positioned to face these two men. And I was watching them like, um, you would watch a newborn child, if you were the parent, with love and devotion and incredible trepidation. um, every movement, and I could just about hear what they were saying to each other, but not obviously. And the pub was loud because there's the football match on, and then a goal was scored, and the instinct of everyone in the pub was to look, if you weren't already looking at the TV, is to look at the TV and see what happened. And Freud and Auerbach looked the other way at everyone's faces, looking at the TV. They had this primal instinct to harvest pure emotion from the faces of these people at the point of its at its hottest point. And it taught me everything. You know, it was like 3 years of art school in a single gesture. You know, that if you develop that instinct to look the other way, look at the face of the thing that's looking at the thing, you'll have a good subject. And I think there's so much in it, partly the bravery and the intensity, but it wasn't a mental thing. They weren't kind of studying faces. It was an animal instinct, and almost feral in a way, you know, that they had that feral instinct to look into the kind of heat of the emotion. And I wonder whether that's, I mean, it certainly got towards the end of their lives, it must have got deeper and deeper, because I saw that was 20 years ago, and it already appeared as if these two men were like old sages, you know, great men of wisdom. And you can only imagine what it must have been like for Frank Auerbach, who was still making work. He had a show at the Courtauld this year of work, of self-portraits, and when you hear his interview, you what you pick up most is that he loves painting, and he found not even a scrap of that same intense joy and experience and depth and so on in any other thing that he did. You know, Freud famously said he used to love gambling, and he'd spend a lot of his money on gambling. And he said it was fun until the point where he had so much money that he couldn't lose everything in a single gamble. So, you know, they both obviously enjoyed relationships with women. um, but really the intense devotion and the kind of powerful, and Bacon, you could argue, was driven also by his relationships, or the kind of deep intensity that he involved himself with other humans. Um, and Kossoff, I know less about, but I know by his work that there's this obvious single line that you can trace from the beginning to where he ended. And the line is to keep looking. You know, it's that intensity of looking.
But
Yeah.
But I mean, you say that, you know, enjoying relationships or being involved in relationships with people, but don't you think it's more about being catalyzed by those relationships? You know, and it
Yeah. Yes.
requires, you know, what I find is interesting is that, and we've spoken about this before, is that it's, you know, the content is not the thing, you know, the content,
Yeah.
the pretext for the thing, which is painting, and what you invest, you know, how much of yourself you invest in it. But I'm also really I'm really interested, like, you know, what you said is that the pivot towards seeing people rather than seeing whatever the external stimulus is. And I wonder whether it is an inborn instinct in that sense, is that which makes you into an artist, which positions you always as, you know, in the role of the observer, that your default is to observe humanity rather than be an observer of you know, or being triggered by things, you know. I mean, I think, well, maybe some of us are taught that. Like, I remember being a child and being trained by my parents not to be reactive to, you know, to outside. I mean, it was considered manners not to react to whatever the crowd reacts to, is to always be just and choose how you respond to things and whether they're worth responding to. But this is something else. This is like almost the shape of your being to watch, you know.
Yeah.
It's really
I definitely feel like, I mean, having certainly when the practice is regular, you know, if you're in the studio a lot, then you do develop, you start to notice that it's an instinct that's in your body, not your head, if you like. So you really kind of you become like a tuning fork, and what you're tuning into is something maybe unseen to most people. And that is kind of intoxicating to be able to tune into that. So, and I imagine both Bacon work from photographs, but I don't think that takes the intensity down in any way. I think the way that they practiced their work, their relationship with what it was that they were painting was unrelenting. I mean, they Bacon, Auerbach's models would, one of them described it as what did she say? I can't remember how anyway, very difficult. And Freud would have you lying there in the cold for days and days,
For days
and
and days.
no,
No,
yeah,
you
I
can
mean, yeah,
tell, but you can tell in the models that they were not comfortable in the least.
yeah.
And
He's
we,
not interested in that kind
yeah,
of comfort. Yeah,
yeah, well, he's not interested in their repose. He was interested in
no,
delivering something. But I also think with Bacon, although he did reference photographs, I don't think the work has any derivation, because he would have, in
no,
a photograph, I would almost say that, and I don't know whether it would have employed color photography, but it seems like he has, that it was actually about creating a certain texture, like, and a certain surface,
hmm,
that the photography would enable him, to slide
yeah,
in things in the paint. So it was more about manipulation of paint rather than referencing a body, because there's so much movement, right? A
right.
photograph cannot capture that. So, but yeah, but when you look at, and I was going to say, looking at people, considering that Auerbach painted, focus so much on self-portraits, how do you turn that gaze on yourself? That's a whole other project, right? And
Well, he spoke about that. He never did a self-portrait until lockdown, till COVID hit, and he suddenly didn't have his models, access to his models, and so the self-portraits came towards the end, and it makes them so much more tender, because he's finally turned that gaze upon himself. Um, Freud was doing them all through his life, and I think I would say, even in the landscapes that Freud and Kossoff and Auerbach and did, um, there's a kind of human element. I don't know. I'm interested in what you might think about it. Certainly where they came from, they all had to flee persecution and destruction, and in a way, even in Frank Auerbach's paintings of building sites, they're also kind of reminiscence of bombed cities and rubble. And Freud had a way of looking at the world uh, in a way that was so sort of intensely dispassionate. So he was able to kind of drain the human suffering out of a scene and just paint the flesh or the leaf. The only time you feel as if he's invested in a kind of love sense is when he's painting an animal. His paintings of the dogs or the horses, they're almost romantic, where everything else is so drained of that.
well, because they're
Um,
innocent.
and I'm sure, yeah, but he also had a kind of, and he's Freud speaks about it, and maybe there's something in that they're, because they're so relying on their instincts, they feel more like an animal in that sense. They're so in tune with that level of primal contact with sensations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, but I really do feel that the sense of, I mean, maybe that's why, it's kind of interesting that you said that they were all fleeing persecution, because Bacon,
Mm.
as a gay man, would have been fleeing persecution. So
Yeah,
it's interesting that
yeah,
he found community with three Jews. So
yeah.
it's kind of, because I was just thinking, well, how, because I didn't actually draw that analogy. I thought, until the point is like, it's
Mm.
like three three Jews and a gay man, become friends in a pub, walk into a pub, as it were. And it's kind of, it's, but but it is,
Yeah,
there's sort of
yeah,
reflection on society, and you find that kind of understanding of what being an outsider is like, and what being a witness to chaos is
yeah.
like, and which is the job of the artist, which I think is, is interesting. But I also uh I'm still kind of thinking around that juxtaposition of their practice with, say, what was happening, in America at that time, which is because I think
Yes.
at that time there was way more contact between American and European artists, especially because a number of, so many European artists fled to New York, during at the onset of World War II. And so that conversation was happening. And I think in many ways, you have twin paradigms being established
Mm.
in some ways in their painting traditions. And I wonder
Yeah.
whether the painting tradition or legacy that these four have established can be reflected on right now in like very discrete British terms, perhaps, or whether we're thinking, I mean, because Freud and Bacon have had like potentially a greater influence internationally through greater exposure, and then
Yeah.
Auerbach and Kossoff seem to be kind of very entrenched in the British tradition, and I'm sort of trying to process why, because I also struggle with Kossoff and
Yeah.
Auerbach because they're so fucking messy, they're so, they're unapologetically
Yeah. Yeah.
about the mess, about the chaos,
Yeah.
and I think
Mm.
it's probably a cultural matrix in Britain
Mm.
where it makes more sense than does not necessarily translate outside of that context. And I wonder what you think about that.
Mm. Definitely. I mean, there is a kind of tolerance for squalor in the British culture, and a kind of celebration for that. If a thing's been caked in layers of gathered, I'm not just talking about mess, but in terms of the way history and story is layered up here, it's like an old chair that's been sat on by thousands of people through time is revered. It's got a kind of sacredness. So there isn't there's a real love of that kind of character. And I think also, although you could also draw parallels with someone like Modigliani, and the way he laid up work, and so maybe there's they're also Kossoff and Auerbach were less outward looking, like Auerbach almost never went out. He hated doing interviews. He did like one in the last 10 years or something. His son Jake made a film which he resisted being made, and it was made, and that happened, but very little else, and so possibly it's just in the realm of them wanting to share they just wanted to make painting, and so whereas Freud was, even though he was so often in the studio, he was also kind of he liked to go to parties, and he
Yeah.
had
He was a
friends in high
vain
places.
guy.
Yeah. And I think you could say the same for Bacon. He definitely played the room. So possibly there's just a bit of it in that.
Reality.
And I also think that Auerbach and Kossoff's paintings are, if you love them, then you love them.
Mm.
But if you don't get them, then it's easy to just see a kind of bunch of crusty paint on a surface. It's an amazing gift, though, when it twigs. I didn't get Auerbach initially, and Kossoff, I was like, that's just a mud. Um, and then there's a moment where you see that little fleck of color within the gray, or you understand that they're kind of sculptural as well as painting, and then that it they're miraculous. You know, they're so beautiful.
And
Yeah.
and was it a case of you seeing like a whole show? Because I have, like, to be honest,
Mm,
I haven't seen, and this is, I guess, the value of either a
yeah.
retrospective or a concerted body of
Mm,
work where you get to live inside, a practice
right. Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
experience a work at a time. I find
Mm.
it really difficult, seeing one work at a time. It's
Definitely. That transformed to around the period, around the time of Lucian Freud dying. There were couple of full retrospectives that I managed to see. The best one was the one at the Reina Sofia in Madrid, and it was one of those shows where it takes you from where he began and where he ended up. And for someone whose practice was, in a way, really constant, but in another way, I wrestle with this sometimes when you have a commission to paint someone and it's well paid. How do you assimilate that into your own, what do you think of as your practice? And Freud is always a great example to me in this, that his work is his work, whether he's painting the Duke of whatever, or he's painting his daughter lying on the sofa. And so that show gave me this incredible experience, this expansive experience of his work. And with Auerbach, I've only ever seen small gallery shows where it's enough to see 12 or 13 paintings of his in one space. And actually, is enough because the work's so dense. I do hope we'll get a full retrospective now because there's a show of his landscapes currently up in London, and there was the Courtauld one, which is recent work. But I think if it'd be scandalous if there isn't one in the next few years.
Well, no, I mean, this is me being a gallerist, because I saw that he wasn't actually, he was with Marlborough Gallery or something,
Yeah,
they closed down
yeah,
earlier in the
it
year. So
goes.
like,
Yeah,
my default think is like, who's going to who's going to
yeah.
manage the estate? He's like, it's because that's now on them. That is, this is the
That's the big one. Yeah. Well,
marketing version, because as the horror of the estate business that galleries are getting into, right?
sure. Yeah, yeah.
This is that
There'll be someone like the Gagosian waiting, I'm
hovering
sure.
hovering in the wings
Yeah.
or something.
Mm,
No, it's really, but for me, with the retrospectives that I've seen of Freud, what I've always found fascinating is that in his younger years he's trying to be more adventurous stylistically. He's got those exaggerated eyes and flat
yeah.
surfaces. Whereas normally we expect more academically focused practice at the
Right.
start,
Yeah.
and then more sort of like more detached practice at the end. Whereas in his case, it's the reverse. Like if you compare it
Mm,
to something like a retrospectives of even like of Philip Guston, it's like he
mm,
starts super, like there's a so
yeah.
beautiful show where he starts, his academic portraits are exquisite, his
Mm,
technique is extraordinary, his understanding of shape, color,
mm,
precision and mark making is well, and then he becomes who he is. Whereas with Freud, it's exactly kind of almost the opposite, and I found that
yeah.
very interesting. And there's
Great.
almost something, but also weirdly, also there's something very German about his early
Mm,
works that you can compare it to, like to sensibility and approach to color, and he becomes kind of
mm,
more British towards the end. Also with the light, I don't know. I was just
mm,
processing all of this in real time because I haven't
mm,
thought about it that way. But it's really, it's really, really interesting to think about artists and in their, and would you like considering, I mean, like I also am thinking about Bacon, whether or not you can readily see his influence or his impact on
mm,
either on those I mean, in that grouping, to be honest, it's hard to see that they've
Hard
influenced
to
each other.
see, although they speak about it. I mean, I've heard interviews with Bacon, and more recently with the Bacon interviews with Sylvester, or like David Sylvester, the critic, are a kind of, apart from anything, if you're an artist and you're listening to this and you haven't read, and actually better to listen to those interviews, it's almost as useful as listening to Cennino Cennini's discourse on Renaissance painting. You know, they're so precise and they're so helpful. The way Bacon describes the process of making a painting, not just the kind of practicality of it, but the psychological world building and the way he describes what it is that he's doing. It's so helpful, and you wouldn't think, knowing him as an artist, that you would think that he would use that opportunity of speaking about his work to kind of to do what the painting does, which is to kind of rip you apart and shock you. But it's actually very tender, and you feel like he's aware that someone might be listening sometime and find it helpful. So that's worth doing, by the way. But when you hear them talking about them as a group, they always deny that they're a group. You know, they said they were friends. Auerbach said recently that, what do you think about, you were called the London group or something? And he said, he sort of laughed at that as if that's just something someone else wrote. But he does say that they were dear friends and they would call on each other all the time. And I think maybe the greatest influence they had on each other was in kind of keeping each other painting, you know. Auerbach apparently was the only person that Freud would allow to comment on his painting. So Frank Auerbach used David Dawson, Lucian Freud's assistant, spoke about how, or maybe it was Freud who said it even, which would be more revealing, but that the only person that was allowed to tell him if a painting was finished was Frank Auerbach. And that tells you so much, because I mean, back to my brief moment of meeting them and watching them speak together, and you asked about what it was that held them together, you know, and also why there wasn't an obvious kind of stylistic connection or influence. I think that their influence was more on a kind of love. Obviously, they loved each other, and Auerbach speaks about his friendship with Kossoff so tenderly, and I think Bacon too. You know, I think they love Bacon. You know, their friendship that they had with him. I don't know about Kossoff and Bacon, but I know that Auerbach and Freud were close with him. I think that they all. I think that the foundation of their friendship was love and a respect for the singularity that they each had in their devotion to painting. And I think that the function that they played was more in the helping each other get back to the studio. So it was really like, if I'm going to see somebody, and I don't want to see anybody because I want to paint, so I'd rather just be in the studio. But if I am going to see somebody, I should at least see someone who has the same affliction, you know.
Yeah.
And my observation of watching those two men speak to each other wasn't it wasn't like a backslapping kind of, there wasn't laughing. It was very intense. It was like this beady-eyed, focused, and they weren't speaking the whole time either. They were just kind of in each other's presence. And it's like they were charging their batteries and feeling a kinship. And that kinship can be, you could also see it as a kinship that maybe came from having had a similar background, biography, and having more or less decided to reject that and just focus on the future, on the next painting. anyway, that's kind of what it appears to me. I mean, there are all those photos of them hanging out in Soho and drinking together, and I'm sure they had a great time. But definitely as they got older, they met for breakfast
They
or
met,
lunch.
so their trajectory shifted towards daytime,
Yeah,
as the
yeah,
energy levels declined, but they had
probably,
to
yeah.
keep the fires burning. I mean, I can see that trajectory shifting in my life as well,
Mhm.
So, which could be the right moment to complete this conversation. But
Yeah,
it's fantastic, and it's also, shares in the love that loves you back, right?
yeah,